Hi, this is Talib Khan, and today we are going to see the concept of types of majority used in parliament. When we talk about this concept of types of majority, then we have to understand certain dimensions associated with this also. If you see the provisions of the constitution, you will see that in constitution we see two types of majority, and the concepts are simple majority and special majority. But when we decipher these concepts, you will see that there are certain other dimensions associated with this. So on the basis of all those dimensions, if you see in the parliament, we can see various types of majority which we need to understand. The first thing which we need to see is the concept of simple majority. When we talk about this concept of simple majority, then again we have to understand that how this comes into existence, what are the processes where we see the use of this simple majority. Again, we have this concept of effective majority. When we see this concept of effective majority, again we have to understand that what are the examples of effective majority and how do we see the use of this concept of effective majority. We also have this concept of absolute majority. We have to understand this very clearly that all these types of majority which we are talking about here, if you see these concepts, you will not find them in the constitution. The constitution specifies about this concept of simple majority, and along with this concept of simple majority, it specifies this concept of special majority. And the basic difference between this concept of simple majority as well as special majority is in the process. If we talk about this concept of special majority, we can also come up with various types of this special majority. Like we can come up with the system as type 1, as type 2, as type 3 and type 4. We have to see this concept that whenever we talk about this concept of simple majority and when we talk about the concept of special majority, the basic difference between these two concepts can be understood through the system that in the concept of simple majority, we require more than 50%. On the other hand, when we talk about this concept of special majority, here we require not less than 2/3. But the point is, this is a basic difference. Along with this basic difference, we also need to understand various dimensions associated with this. And to understand all those dimensions, I would at first like to give you an example. If you talk about an example, if you see the concept of an example, just suppose take an example of a classroom. When we talk about a classroom, just try to understand that there is a total sanctioned strength of a classroom. And if you talk about this concept of total sanctioned strength, let's take an example that the total sanctioned strength of a classroom as 100. So we are talking about a class. We are talking about a classroom where the total sanctioned strength is 100. Now the point is, when we open the admissions, the total admission in the classroom can be 100 and 100 students came in the class. But when you move further after 1 month, 2 months of the session of the class, you will see that the effective strength changes. And there can be various reasons behind this change of effective strength. For example, the total strength was 100, but the effective strength came to be as 95. There can be some sort of vacancy in the class. Vacancy in the sense like some of the students left the class because their father got transferred, or some of the students changed the class because they wanted to have association in any other organization or any other institute. So there can be some sort of vacancy. Just suppose we have 5 as vacancy. Now the point is, the total strength of this classroom is 100. However, the effective strength is 95 because we have 5 vacancies. Now let's come back to the class again. When we talk about this concept of class, we have to understand that it is not necessary that every day all the effective strength of the class will be present in the classroom. So just suppose take another example that on any particular day like day 1, we saw 80 students. So out of 100, we had the effective strength as 95, but only 80 students were present in the class. If you move further into this concept, then you have to understand that if 80 students were present in the class and suddenly the teacher announces that today we have a surprise test. So if you see this surprise test, you will see that it is not necessary that out of 80 students, all the students appear in the test also. So just suppose out of 80, 70 students appeared in the test. So 100 is the total strength, but if you see how many students appeared in the test, it comes out to be 70 only. And if you see this 70, you have to understand that out of this 70, how many students passed in the exam, in the class test. So it can be any number, whatever number you want, you can have that. Just suppose out of 70, 40 students passed in the classroom. This is the number which we can say that 40 students passed in the classroom. And if in this situation, if in this scenario, you want to take the quality of the teacher, you want to see that was the teacher able to deliver the concepts which he was talking about, then how will you see that concept? And you have to see that concept through the concept of majority. So through this very example, you can understand all the concept of majority which we had seen in the last slide. That is, all these concepts of majority can be understood through this concept of classroom. And we can see this concept of classroom through the concept of what we call as the parliament also. I will just explain the concept through this situation which we see in parliament. But before that, just try to understand this example. I'm explaining this again so that this becomes very much clear. This is the total strength, but effectively the strength is 95. Why? Because we had 5 vacancies. Again, if you move forward, then on a particular day, 80 students appeared in the class. But when it was about the test, only 70 students appeared in the test. And out of this 70, only 40 students passed the test. So if you want to see that was the teacher successful in delivering the concept, how will you see that? Now, for that you have to see that majority of the students were able to understand the concept or not able to understand the concept. And in this very scenario, you have to understand that from which number you will compare, because 40 students appear in the class. If you see the majority on the basis of how many of them were how many of them gave the test, then you will see that the teacher passed. On the other hand, if you see it on the basis of the attendance, then also the teacher passed. But what about if you see it on the basis of total strength? What about if you see it on the basis of effective strength? And this is what makes different types of amendment and the concept of different types of majority which we see in the parliament. And through that very concept, we come to the concept of types of amendments also. So if you see this, just try to understand this very example with reference to the parliament. Just like we mentioned it here, we have the concept of parliament also. When we talk about this concept of parliament, you will see that in parliament also, you will find all these concepts one by one. So just change the numbers on the basis of parliament. Let's take the example of Lok Sabha. If you talk about this concept of Lok Sabha, then again you have to understand the dimensions associated with this. Lok Sabha. What is the total strength of Lok Sabha? So if you talk about the total strength of Lok Sabha, let's take the number as 543. So this is the number for which we see the general elections. Now the point is, the total strength of Lok Sabha is 543. When the general elections are held, it is held for 543 seats. But there is always a chance of vacancy. So there can be some sort of vacancy also in the Lok Sabha. For example, some of the members died. Some of the members resigned. Some of the members were removed due to anti-defection law or various other issues. So just assume a number as 13. Just suppose there are 13 vacancies in the Lok Sabha also. Here vacancy means for which by-poll are to be held. So there are 543 seats in Lok Sabha, and that is the total strength. If you see this number, then there are 13 vacancies also. So what will be the effective strength? To understand this concept of effective strength, we can simply understand it as the concept of total strength minus vacancy. So when we come up with this calculation, you will see that the effective strength becomes as 530. Now these numbers are very much important, because you will see that when we have to see the concept associated with various processes in the parliament, then on the basis of those processes we see different types of majority also. I will just explain one by one. Now this is the total strength, this is the vacancy, and this is the effective strength. Now just suppose on any particular day how this parliament behaves. So if we talk about any particular day, just suppose we can take the example of 2 different days. If you see this, take the example of 2 different days in the parliament and try to understand this concept. So we can see it as day 1 and day 2. Just suppose on day 1, if you talk about the total attendance, then on day 1, the total attendance in the parliament was, we can take any number as 300. On the other hand, on day 2, the total strength was, just suppose, 520. Now, if you move forward into this concept, you have to understand this very clearly, that if 300 members were present in the Lok Sabha on a particular day, it is not necessary that all of them will vote also. So just suppose out of 300, only 250 members voted. And here on day 2, out of 520, 500 members voted. If you move further into this concept, then you have to understand that how many are the absentees here. If you talk about the absentees, on day 1, we can see the number of absentees as 50. On the other hand, on day 2, we can see the number of absentees as 20. And on the basis of this very concept, you can see all the concepts of types of amendment and majority which we use in the parliament. All the types of majorities which we have been seeing in the parliament. And let's see them one by one. So let's start with the very first concept, that is the concept of simple majority. If you talk about this concept of simple majority, the constitution provides it as the majority of the members present and voting in the house. Just try to understand this concept. Majority of the members present and voting in the house. So if you talk about this concept, present and voting, also known as working majority, because majority of the functions of parliament are done through this concept of simple majority. Whenever you see that the constitution does not provide that which type of majority is to be used, in that case, this concept of simple majority will be used. So when we talk about this concept of simple majority, it simply comes up with the concept of present and voting in the house. Now, if you see this concept on the basis of the classroom as well as here, then you will automatically be able to understand this. If you talk about this concept, you have to understand that if we take the example of classroom, then present and voting. Now, on a particular day, if you talk about this in the classroom, on day 1, just try to see how many of the students were present. 80 students were present. But how many of them appeared in the test? Only 70 students appeared in the test. So, present and voting, if you talk about this present and voting wala concept, you have to understand this very clearly, that we are talking about how many of them appeared in the test. And if you see this number, then we have to see the majority of 70, that is more than 35. This means 36. Now, the point is, whenever you talk about this concept of simple majority, it simply means majority of the members present and voting in the house. So, if you see this example here, just try to understand that what happens on day 1 as well as what happens on day 2. If you see these two concepts, just try to see. On day 1, how many of the members were present? 300. But how many of them voted? 250 only. So, we have to take the majority of 250, that is 126. On the other hand, if you see the simple majority on day 2, it turns out to be 251. Why? Because we are seeing this majority of the members present and voting in the house. This concept of simple majority needs to be understood very clearly, because it is also known as working majority. And majority of the functions of parliament are done through this concept of simple majority only, including this confidence as well as no confidence motion. So when you see this concept, you automatically will be able to understand that how this is used also. Either it be the passage of budget, or it be the concept of passing this abolition or creation of legislative council in the states in the parliament. In all these concepts, we see the use of simple majority. In the case of joint sitting also, we see the use of simple majority. Let's move further into this concept of types of majority. So the next thing which we need to understand here is this concept of effective majority. And to understand this concept of effective majority, we just need to understand one dimension, that is the majority of effective strength of the house. If you see this concept of effective majority, it simply means the majority of effective strength of the house. And what is the effective strength of the house? Effective strength means total strength minus vacancy. So if you move here into this concept, you have to understand that in the example of this parliament Lok Sabha, we saw this number. Now, according to this number, what is the effective strength? The effective strength is 530. So whenever we have to take this effective majority, we have to take this majority of effective strength of the house. If you see this type of majority which is used in the case of removal of presiding officers, then you will see that in those examples, either it be Article 67 Clause B. If you see this provision of Article 67 Clause B, it specifies about the process of removal of Vice President of India. Vice President of India. Why am I specifying about Vice President of India? Because we need to understand that this process of removal of Vice President of India means the process of removal of Chairman of Rajya Sabha also. So whenever we talk about this effective majority, it is used in only one instance, and the instance is removal of presiding officers. Whenever we have to remove any presiding officer, in that case, this concept of effective majority is used, which simply means majority of the effective strength of the house. When you see these provisions, here you will find the term as all the then members of the house. So it doesn't matter how many are present, it doesn't matter how many are absent. It only means that how many, what is the effective strength of the house, that is all the then members of the house. Now, if you see this concept of all the then members, then you have to understand this very clearly, that either it will be the example of classroom, which we saw here. So, if you talk about this classroom here, effective majority, what will be this effective majority? You can see this effective majority as 48. On the other hand, if you move with this concept of parliament, then on a particular day in Lok Sabha, either it be day 1 or day 2, you have to see this effective strength. So, effective strength is 530 and we have to take this majority of effective strength. So, what will it turn out to be? The majority of 530. And if you see this majority of 530, it will come somewhere around 266. Now, this is what we need to understand. 266 is the effective majority in the Lok Sabha. So, if you have to remove the presiding officer of Lok Sabha, that is Speaker of Lok Sabha, you need to have 266 votes in favor of removal. But when you see this concept, you have to understand that on day 1, only 250 members voted. When only 250 members voted and all of them voted for removal of the presiding officer, then also that motion cannot be passed. Why? Because we need to have 266. So, there is no chance of passing this effective majority on day 1. Why? Because only 250 members voted. On the other hand, if you see the same concept on day 2, you will see that there is a possibility of passing this effective majority on day 2 if out of 500 votes, 266 votes went in the favor of removal of presiding officer. So, this is the concept of effective majority. Again, if you move forward into this concept, then you have to understand the next concept, and the next concept is about this absolute majority. In the concept of this absolute majority, we have to understand only one dimension. That is, it doesn't matter how many are present, how many are absent, how many are voting. It means the majority of the total strength of the house. So, whenever we take this total strength, the majority of this concept of total strength is known as absolute majority. And the best part about this majority is it is not used individually anywhere in the provisions of the parliament. Whenever we see this concept of absolute majority, we see this concept of absolute majority with some other type of majority. So, if absolute majority is used, it will be used with some other types of majority. I will just explain where it is used. But it means the majority of total strength of the house. It doesn't matter how many are present, how many are absent. So, if you talk about either it be day 1 or it be day 2. On any particular day, if you see this concept, then the total strength remains same, that is 543, and the majority of 543 will turn out to be absolute majority, which in our example will be 272. So, whenever we have to see this concept of absolute majority, we have to see this number only. And you might have seen in the system of elections a term which is very much popular. And if you see that term, that is political majority. That is, the structure can come into existence. And these Hindi terms like Bahumat. Now, when you talk about these concepts, you have to understand that in the parliament or in the state legislature, the concept used there is simple majority, but we go through this concept of 272 or whatever the structure we talk about. Why? Because we have to understand that whenever we talk about this strength, this is the absolute majority. If you get this number, no other structure can have the majority. So, this absolute majority gives you the concept of political majority also. It shows the political strength of the political party or the alliance in the structure. And that is why this becomes very much important. But we have to understand that it is not used individually anywhere in the constitution. At no point you will see it being used individually. Whenever it is used with some other types of majority. So, this is the concept of simple majority, effective majority, and absolute majority. If you move forward into this concept, then the next dimension which we need to understand is this dimension of special majority. When we talk about this dimension of a special majority, the first thing which we need to understand is instead of more than 50%, we have to see the number as not less than 2/3. So, at no point we will talk about more than 50%, we will talk about not less than 2/3. So, whenever we talk about the numbers in the case of this special majority, we have been talking about this not less than 2/3. And there are various types of special majority also. But to understand these types, I would at first like to explain those concepts which we have seen earlier. If you see this concept, this special majority type 1, if you see this concept of special majority type 1, it is used in only two instances, that is Article 249 and Article 312. I will explain these concepts, what do we mean by this 249 as well as 312. But it is similar to simple majority. whatever we see in the concept of simple majority, it is similar to simple majority. On the other hand, when we talk about this concept of special majority type 2, which we see in the case of Article 368, you will see that it means type 1 along with this concept of absolute majority. This is the concept of special majority type 2. If you move forward into this concept of special majority type 3, we can understand it as type 2 plus state legislature. I will just explain all those concepts. I'm just trying to make the concepts clear. If you are able to understand these concepts once, if you are able to understand this diagram once, you will automatically be able to understand all the concepts. And if you talk about this type 4, it is similar to absolute majority with one condition, that is, here in the concept of type 4, we don't require this more than 50%. We require not less than 2/3. Now, let's see the concept one by one. So what was the scenario in simple majority? In the scenario of simple majority, we saw the process in a very different manner. And what was that manner? The manner was, we wanted to have the majority of the members present and voting. So this is what happens in the case of type 1 also. Whenever we see this concept of type 1, in the concept of type 1, we just see one dimension, that is not less than 2/3 of the members present and voting in the house. So if you talk about this scenario, this 249, the examples are 249 and 312. If you see these two examples, these are special powers of Rajya Sabha. But I'm just explaining it from the point of view of Lok Sabha, so I am specifying it here also. So if you want to have this type 1 special majority type 1, that is, which is used under Article 249 and Article 312, what we need to have? We need to have more than not less than 2/3 of the members present and voting in the house. So if you see this example here, you have to understand that on a particular day, this is not working. On a particular day, if you have to take this type 1, what you have to see? You have to see not less than 2/3 of 250. On day 2, you have to see not less than 2/3 of 500. So this is what we need to understand. How many members voted in the house? On the basis of that, we have to see this. If on the basis of the voted, if we get 2/3, then that is the majority which we need to have here in the case of special majority type 1. So in the case of simple majority, what happened? In the case of simple majority, we saw the concept as more than 50%, but in the case of special majority type 1, we are seeing the concept of not less than 2/3. This is the basic dimension of special majority type 1, used in only two instances, that is Article 249 and Article 312, both are the special powers of Rajya Sabha. On the other hand, if you move forward into this concept, then the next thing which we need to understand here is this concept of type 2. So if you talk about this concept of type 2, what I had specified earlier, I had specified that this type 2 is type 1 plus absolute majority. You don't need to add here. The only thing which you need to assure is that whatever number we get from type 1, whatever number is there in the case of type 1, we have to see that this number should not be less than the absolute majority. And here we see the use of absolute majority. I had specified it earlier also that absolute majority is not used independently, and you can see the use of absolute majority here. So whenever you talk about this dimension of special majority type 2, which is used under Article 368 of Indian Constitution, that is, which provides for constitutional amendment. So whenever we have to come up with this concept of constitutional amendment, it comes through this type 2 majority. Not only this, you will see that the process of removal of various constitutional structures like the judges of Supreme Court and High Court, like CAG and many more, you will see that whenever we have to remove these structures, then whenever we have to remove the judges of the Supreme Court or High Courts or CAG, etc., then this type of majority is used in both the houses of parliament. So what happens here in this scenario? In this scenario, we have to make sure that we have to get this 2/3, that is not less than 2/3 of the members present and voting. And along with that, we also need to understand that it should not be less than absolute majority. So if you see this number here, if we have to understand this special majority type 2, the first thing is we have to see it on day basis. So we have to see this not less than 2/3 of 250 or not less than 2/3 of 500. But along with that, we have to also make sure that we need to have absolute majority. And it becomes very much clear that on day 1, it is not possible to pass it. Why? Because only 250 members voted. So even if all of them are voting in favor, then also we will not be able to get this absolute majority. On the other hand, there is a possibility that we can have it on day 2 if not less than 2/3. Along with that, this concept of absolute majority also comes into existence. So this 2/3 number which comes into existence, we have to make sure that after this 2/3, it should also come up with this absolute majority, that is in our example not less than 272. If you move forward into this concept, let's see the other concepts associated with this. So this is the concept of type 2. If you move forward into this concept of special majority type 3, then it is an addition of this type 2. What happens here? So there are certain provisions in the constitution, especially mentioned under this article 368, which specifies that whenever we are doing this constitutional amendment on the specified provisions, for example changing the 7th schedule of the constitution, so whenever we see these provisions, in that case the ratification by state legislature is also required. Now the point is ratification by state legislature. Just try to understand this dimension. If you talk about this ratification by state legislature, you have to understand this very clearly, that whenever any constitutional amendment is being passed, for example, we saw in the case of GST. Now the point is, when we see this constitutional amendment, we have to understand this very clearly, that ratification by state legislature is also required. So what happens in this special majority type 3 needs to be understood very clearly. Whatever we saw in the case of type 2, that will be there in existence. The provisions which we saw in type 2, that will be there in existence. So after things are done on the basis of this type 2, then after that what happens? The process of passing a legislation is that if Parliament, that is Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, passes it, then after the passage from Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, it goes to the President for assent. But whenever it is about this type 3 that is mentioned under Article 368 itself, Article 368 provides for this concept of constitutional amendment, but it provides for two types of constitutional amendments. The first type is done by the Parliament, and the second type is done by the Parliament as well as the state legislature. So I'm talking about this second type. What happens here? We have to understand this very clearly, that when Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha passes the bill, then it goes to the state legislature. And when you see the concept of state legislature, then the bill needs to be ratified by not less than 50% of the state legislature also. How many? Not less than 50%. Not less than 50% of the state legislature should ratify it. The state legislature needs to ratify it by simple majority. The concept of simple majority which we saw earlier. So they will ratify it by simple majority only. So what happens here? When the bill is passed by the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, then before getting the assent of the president, it goes to the state legislature, and the state legislature needs to ratify it by simple majority. If a state legislature ratifies it, how many of the states should ratify? Not less than 50% of the state legislature should ratify it. And here state means union territories also with legislation. So if you talk about this, if not less than 50% of the state legislature ratifies it, then after this process, if you see this further, you will see that after this process, it goes to the president for assent. And if the president needs to give the assent, because in the case of constitutional amendment, there is no veto power in the hands of president. So president needs to give its assent, and when president gives the assent, then the constitutional amendment comes into existence. So if you talk about this, this is the concept of type 3. If you see this concept of type 3, we can see it through this one more dimension, that is, when we talk about this concept of type 3, what happens here? Just suppose at first Lok Sabha, then from Lok Sabha to Rajya Sabha. After Lok Sabha to Rajya Sabha, it goes to the state legislature, and after this state legislature, it goes for the assent of president. This is how we see this type 3. On the other hand, if you see the concept with reference to type 2, what happens here? This provision of what we have seen in the case of this state legislature, this is not present in the case of type 2. But when we talk about this concept of constitutional amendment, whenever we see the concept of constitutional amendment, it provides for two concepts, that is type 2 as well as type 3. So this type 2 as well as type 3 both are provided under Article 368 of Indian Constitution, because Article 368 of Indian Constitution provides for this process of constitutional amendment. So whenever we have to do this constitutional amendment, it will either be on the basis of type 2 or be on the basis of type 3. There is one instance of this type 2, this use of type 2 in state legislature also. If you see this concept, then whenever a state legislature has to come up with this resolution of coming up with this legislative council or abolishing this legislative council, then in the case of this abolition or creation of legislative council, it is used in state legislature also. that is abolition or creation of legislative council. This dimension needs to be understood very clearly. But when this resolution passes from the state legislature, then it needs to be ratified by the parliament. And when this legislation goes to the parliament, parliament needs to pass it by simple majority only. That is why you will see the example in both the dimensions. Is this example of type 2 or the example of abolition or creation of legislative council in the state legislature comes under this type 2, and in the parliament comes under this concept of simple majority. The last concept which we need to understand here is this type 4. When we talk about this concept of type 4, we have to understand that there is only one example associated with this, that is the example of impeachment of President of India. You have to understand that the Constitution does not use this term impeachment for any other structure and only for the President of India. So even in the case of the judges, the term impeachment is not used in the Constitution. The term used is removal. And this Article 61 of Indian Constitution, which provides for removal of the impeachment of the President of India, needs to be understood. Here we have to understand that just like we saw the concept of absolute majority, we need to understand this concept of impeachment of president also. So what happened in the case of absolute majority? In the case of absolute majority, we saw that it doesn't matter how many are present, how many are absent, how many are voting, what is the vacancy. Nothing matters. We have to see the total strength and the majority of total strength. So when it is about a special majority type 4, we have to understand that in the case of a special majority type 4, what we need to see? We need to not worry about how many are present, how many are absent, how many are voting, what is the vacancy. We just need to see the total strength and not less than 2/3 of total strength. So whatever the total strength is, we have to see not less than 2/3 of total strength. So what was the total strength in our example? In our example, the total strength was 543. When we talk about this number 543, then we just need to see the majority of 543. And what will be the majority of 543? Just make a calculation. So either it be day 1 or it be day 2. What we need to see? We just need to see the not less than 2/3 of 543. Not less than 2/3 of 543 on day 1 as well as day 2. It doesn't matter how many are present. It doesn't matter how many are absent. We just need to come up with this number. And this is how we see this impeachment of president also. So this is the concept of types of amendment and majority which we see in the parliament. Now, on the basis of these majorities, we see the concept of amendments. If you talk about the concept of amendments, then we can automatically understand this concept of constitutional amendment from here. However, we have to understand this concept of amendment to the constitution as well as constitutional amendment. So when we talk about this concept of constitutional amendment and amendment to the constitution, we need to understand that this amendment to the constitution is a more broader term than the constitutional amendment. Why? Because constitutional amendment comes under Article 368. While when we talk about this amendment to the constitution, it comes up with this concept of 368 plus other provisions also. What do we mean by this other provision? We have to understand that the constitution can be amended through 368, and along with that there are various other processes also. So there is a possibility of amending the constitution through simple majority also. For example, just see what Article 2 or Article 3 of the constitution provides. If you talk about this Article 2 or Article 3, these provides for this concept of this states, and it specifies that the structure of the states is in the hands of the parliament, that too through this simple majority. So if we have to create a new state, if we have to merge two states, how it will be done? It will be done by the simple majority in the parliament. And this concept of simple majority needs to be understood very clearly. And through this process, we are amending the constitution also. So even amending the constitution is possible through this simple majority. But we have to understand that whatever amendment in the constitution is being done through this process of simple majority, it is not known as constitutional amendment. It is just known as amendment to the constitution. And that is why we have to understand that this term amendment to the constitution is much broader than the concept of constitutional amendment. It automatically includes this constitutional amendment as well as the other provisions. This is the concept of types of majority, and on the basis of this concept of types of majority, we can also understand this concept of amendments. And this concept of amendments, when we talk about this whole structure, then let's come back to this first slide again. If you see this, now on the basis of this, you can understand this whole dimension. If you see this dimension again, we have to understand that these two provide for constitutional amendment. But when we talk about this amendment to the constitution, then along with this, we can also see this through this concept of simple majority. This type 4, that is Article 61, provides for impeachment of the president. This effective majority used in the case of removal of presiding officers in that particular house. If you talk about this absolute majority, not used independently, and these are the concepts which we need to understand. We have to understand that this simple majority, when we talk about this, there can be various other examples of the simple majority also. Just try to go through those examples. There can be various other examples of type 2 or type 3 also. So go through those examples, and when you see the questions in examination, the questions will be through these processes only. They will either ask the concept or they will ask the examples. Clear? This is all we have for the time. Thank you.